Hello, everyone. Welcome to New York State Political Science Association 2022 conference. This is a panel on global studies. I'm very glad to have two presenters today. Ryan Hitch from CUNY Graduate Center will be presenting a paper called Historical Memory as a Barrier to Intimacy and Expansion of Chin's Relational Theory of World Politics. Will be followed by another presentation by Daniel Post from Brown University called Escalating to De-Escalate in Post-War Games and Crisis Simulations. After that, we will have Frank Levenes, who's a professor of government and politics in St. John's University, who will be serving as a discussant. And we will conclude by a general discussion of the papers and related ideas, research ideas. So thank you all for joining us virtually. I hope we can be in person next year. And with that, I'll turn over to Ryan. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I will just share my screen here. And we see this all right?
Looks good.
All right, great. So thank you again for the introduction and for inviting me to my first conference presentation. I will be presenting my paper as was already stated, and I would like to thank my co-author, Kozal Path, from Brooklyn College for his contributions and comments on my paper. So I'd like to start by generally introducing a new field, a new school of international relations that has been developing. That is the Chinese School of International Relations. I see Chin's Relational Theory of World Politics, which was published in 2018 as a key work in this school. In this work, he proposes a new framework to understand Asian international relations based on Confucianist culture. Chin argues that relationality, rather than rationality, is at the core of state relations. One idea he posits is that we could understand state relations on a two-dimensional plane of intimacy and importance. He gives one example, a few examples of state relations that could be described like this. For example, the relation between China and Cambodia can be understood as highly intimate, but yet fairly unimportant in the grand scheme of relations, whereas China's relations with the United States is highly important, yet highly unintimate. We can look at intimacy as the closeness of relations, and this is a construct of identity, how close states identify with one another, whereas importance is rather consideration of military and economic power. However, Chin pays little attention to those factors that might prevent intimacy, rather focusing on factors that support intimacy, for example, close diplomatic relations and high-level meetings by top government officials. We see that this framework could be useful to understand historical disputes in the East and Southeast Asia region. These regions are marked by continued historical disputes in spite of highly close economic ties. And these disputes are often instigated by governments actively seeking to solidify and legitimate their governments and also to mobilize nationalism. The aim of our research is to investigate how historical disputes can contribute to reduced intimacy between several countries in East and Southeast Asia. To this aim, we utilize a within-case process tracing method for 3 case studies. And with this method, we aim to demonstrate that there is first, a salient historical dispute, second, a dispute that is activated instrumentally by governments or elites, and 3, that acts as a barrier to intimacy between the dyads. Our cases are the relations between South Korea and Japan, Vietnam and China, and Cambodia and Vietnam. Initially, we started the project with the first two cases and more recently added the case of Cambodia and Vietnam, so I won't be able to comment on that case yet in this presentation. We chose these dyads because each has a similar regime type and strong economic ties, which theoretically should contribute to closer intimacy, yet each dyad seems to struggle with disputes over historical issues. So some preliminary findings from our case studies. We find that Japan and South Korea continue to struggle over historical disputes regarding World War II. More specifically, the Yasukuni Shrine and the issue of comfort women continue to be focal points in these broader historical disputes. And we find that the trend of Japanese nationalism has been a strong force for historical revisionism. Moreover, these disputes have given both Japanese and South Korean politicians domestic capital, and so we see that there is an instrumental use of historical disputes in these countries' relations. Our case on China and Vietnam is a little bit more complicated. We find that their present relations are tense, but it's less clear how historical disputes over their war in 1979 play a role in this tension. Both governments previously repressed popular discussion of the war, starting in the 1990s when they normalized relations. However, this is slowly changing on the Vietnamese side as the government is more willing to allow popular commemoration of the war. Just some overall thoughts from our findings. We do see a willingness by elites in Japan and South Korea to instrumentally use historical disputes. However, China has not mobilized historical grievance against Vietnam in a similar way that we see its willingness to use this narrative of the 100 years of national humiliation, which is targeted against the West and Japan. However, this could change if Vietnam drifts further away from China, so it will be interesting to watch China as the relations evolve. Overall, we find that the continued salience of historical memory in these regions requires further theoretical innovation, and the developing Chinese School of International Relations could provide further insights for the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will turn over the floor to Daniel.
Great, thank you. So I am happy to be here, and I really enjoyed that presentation, Ryan. I have questions already, so I look forward to talking. So my project is a bit different. I'm going to share my screen as well, and hopefully this will work smoothly. And you should see a slideshow that I'm now playing from the start. Does that look good for everyone?
That's great.
Great. So we've already been introduced, so I will move on and just say I'm going to talk about this project briefly in these ways. I'm going to introduce the research question after discussing a little bit of the motivation behind it, lay out my hypothesis for this particular project, the research design, a brief discussion of the preliminary results, and then we can talk about anything you want to talk about after that. So the motivating question and background here is that this project is under the larger umbrella of questions around the idea of limited nuclear war and the ability to keep a war that involves nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon states from growing beyond out of control, essentially. And so this question in red here is the more specific area where there's this debate about whether or not the limited use of a nuclear weapon might actually be used to de-escalate a conflict rather than triggering a out of control process of reciprocal escalation. And the quote from Thomas Schelling in 1963, I think is absolutely equally true or applicable today as it was then, many years ago. So that's a little bit more of the background. The origins of this debate, this limited nuclear war debate, are found in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union established nuclear parity with the United States, and the threat of nuclear retaliation was, the credibility of that threat was questioned. And so theorists and strategists started to think about, well, how can we deal with this lack of credibility now? And this idea of limited nuclear war took hold. And so having the ability to fight with nuclear weapons at lower levels is supposed to enhance deterrence. And it's also supposed to offer options that are something between suicide, giving up, or suicide as in triggering the mutually assured destruction, and giving up. They might be useful, nuclear weapons might be useful on the battlefield. And then this idea of escalate to de-escalate that I'm going to talk about. And so you can read through these quotes, in particular the last two, and you can see that, these last two quotes, both from US officials about the role that nuclear weapons might play in escalation, they're basically opposite views. And again, this is the motivation for looking at how and why might nuclear weapons use be de-escalatory. And so a couple of just brief definitions, and de-escalation is pretty self-explanatory there, but escalation, this is Richard Smoke's definition. And it's basically has to do with the idea of saliencies and thresholds. So a state is escalating if it's deliberately, in my case, crossing a threshold that's a known threshold amongst the adversaries, and they're purposefully crossing that. And they can do it vertically, which means just enhancing the intensity and lethality of the attacks. They could do it horizontally, meaning geographically or involving other powers, or they could do a combination of both. And then de-escalation in this context is the attempt is to use a nuclear weapon or escalate in some way to achieve conflict termination, not just a reduction in hostilities. And the specific concept, escalate to de-escalate, is laid out here. The two bullets underneath the red are just sort of alternative phrasings of this idea, but the key thing is that it's a deliberate attempt. It's not an accident or unintentional. The actor is intentionally, deliberately crossing some line to try to signal and make a statement. You can get and convince the other side to back down. And so the question is, I wanted to see, since we can't look at history for cases of wars between nuclear powers in which nuclear weapons were used. We don't have a lot of cases of this. We have one case of actual nuclear weapons employment in World War II, and the other side was not nuclear armed. So I wanted to look at something, and I chose to look at war games and crisis simulations. And I won't get into why I chose those, but the paper talks about that, and I think they're a good place to look for evidence and information about this. And so a little bit of the theory behind why this idea might work. It might work because it increases the risk of escalation. It might convey new information to the other side that they didn't have before. And it might enhance the credibility of your threats. But it also might fail because compelling someone, that's Thomas Schelling's term, but coercing someone, making someone do something is difficult in general. In IR, we know this to be this sort of dominant view. Reputation and precedent might trigger fears about the future, and precedent setting might make this an unlikely effort, or unlikely to succeed. The sunk costs involved, a nuclear armed state that is coerced or threatened with nuclear weapons that does not use its own nuclear weapons in response may feel that all those years of investing in nuclear deterrent capability were wasted. Misperceptions, always a problem in international relations. And, if you're fighting with nuclear weapons, you're probably dealing with something that's high stakes. And this idea of absorption is something I talk about in the paper, but it's basically the idea that if you're attacking and fighting a nuclear armed state, you may have already calculated in the idea of that you might be attacked with a nuclear weapon. And so the other side taking that step may not be that shocking. And so the main hypothesis is that when these strategies are attempted in these war games and crisis simulations, they'll fail more often than not, and attempts to do so with nuclear weapons will fail higher than non-nuclear attempts. The design was to look at available un or declassified war games and crisis simulations from archives and open source materials. And I found cases in which these types of escalate to de-escalate attempts occurred. Just briefly, what is a war game? It's an interactive event that involves human players immersed in scenarios, bounded by specific rules that govern their actions, and they're motivated by consequences. They have to live with the consequences of their actions. When they make it, they can't. There's no backseas. You can't take back your actions. Some examples. Some of the things that were actually printed out, just so you can see what they look like. These are government joint war games agency for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. These are final reports by workshops at the Naval Postgraduate School and various other places as outlined in the paper. And simply put, what I found was that this may sound intuitive in some way, that if I escalate in just the right way and signal my commitment to you and my resolve to you, you might give up, but it doesn't work, at least in these settings. And the stakes are, if they weren't high to begin with, which they probably were, they're raised even further when nuclear weapons are used. The other side is a nuclear armed state in these scenarios, and so they have the ability to respond. And basically, escalating has these two kind of possible outcomes. It can do the demonstration of resolve and commitment, but it can also trigger what I've called, at the suggestion of one of my committee members, a belligerency cost. That basically you've done this action, now you look like the bad guy, and now it's harder to trust you, and it's harder to negotiate with you. So I found 41 cases. It works in 3 cases, 1 nuclear case out of 16 and 2 cases out of 25 conventional attempts, meaning attempts of escalate to de-escalate with conventional or nuclear weapons. And even in the cases where it succeeds in terminating the war, they don't actually gain their objectives in the nuclear case. And so it's really not very effective at all. These factors that I identified, misperception, high stakes, and this ability and the willingness to absorb the attack were present in a large degree in these games that are listed here. And people can take a look at those if they want when they're watching this later. And so why does it fail? I'm still thinking about this, but I think it fails because there's something about in a nuclear dyad, when one state escalates in this way, rather than achieving that first outcome where it demonstrates resolve, commitment, credibility, gets the other side to back down, it actually triggers those belligerency costs where the other side has increased incentives to fight back, even if it means very high levels of destruction and damage, and even if they might not win. And so the question of why, and I think a big part of it is that fear of the perception or the precedent-setting concerns, reputational concerns, and the sunk costs in specifically in nuclear deterrent programs, which are very expensive and time-consuming. And so I'm still working through that, but that's the gist of it. I hope I didn't talk too long, but thank you for your time, and I'll stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Both the papers have given us a lot to think about. I will turn over the floor to Frank, and then we can have an open discussion about. I have a couple of questions, and we can go from there. Thank you both.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. And I'm very pleased to have been able to be participant in this particular panel. for no other reason than because I learned a lot. And that's one of the benefits of being a discussant. You get to read the paper in depth of the various participants, and you do tend to learn a lot. This is not particularly my field in specifics. I'm more of a Latin Americanist, Caribbeanist, so that South Asia is certainly, Southeast Asia is certainly not my field of endeavor. I have traveled somewhat extensively in Korea and Japan, and a little bit in China, but not at all in Cambodia and Vietnam. So I don't want to misrepresent that I'm some sort of an expert in those fields. But it seems to me that taking a look at Ryan's paper first, the historical paper or historical memory paper, I was impressed with a number of things, and I'll start out with like page 1. Not that I'm going to go through every single page, no, by any means. Don't panic. But in page 1, he asked a question, or actually he quoted others who had asked the question. I think it was back in 2007. Why are there no non-Western IR? Why is there no non-Western IR theory? And I sat back and I scratched my head on that one a little bit. And I said, it's absolutely true. Most international relations theory is definitely Western, what should we say, Western based, Western grounded, and really permeates the entire world. And the question is, I guess, why? And it's something that the paper doesn't attempt to answer, because that's one of those jello-y questions that you can't pick it up and deal with it very easily, and it's not really the parameter of the paper. But it was a question that the paper brought to my mind, and I want to thank Ryan for doing that, because it's true, or it seems to me to be true. There's very little non-Western, maybe I won't say none, but very little. And I would put it, it depends, I guess, on how you're defining the West. And I might be defining it a little bit differently than Ryan is. And that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I kind of define it more in a north-south perspective rather than an east-west perspective. But I don't think that puts us in any disagreement when you come right down to it. So if I take a look at Latin America, I remember many years ago, I'm not going to tell you how many because I'm not going to give away my age. It's bad enough I have to live with it. You don't have to know about it. But at any rate, all joking aside, I remember years ago, one of the professors with whom I had contact, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not really, talked about Latin America. Now, he was talking about political theory. He wasn't specifically talking about foreign relations theory or international relations theory, as the case might be. But I remember him making a statement. He said, political theory in Latin America is European theory that arrives later and lasts longer. And while I'm sure that's not true in every case, and I don't think he intended to mean it in absolutely every case, the tendency was there. It is largely dominated by the West. And I think an understanding of that is extremely important. I think that if you take a look at any of the major theories of Latin America, even dependency theory, the Western emphasis is there, whether it's a Marxian approach or a Leninist approach. Remember his famous pamphlet on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which works its way into dependency theory very nicely. Or whether you're talking about the works of people like Paul Barron or Paul Swayze or any number of others. There's that strong Western element to it. Now, what about that? What does that mean? Well, among other things, what it means is we may have a faulty understanding, which is, I think, exactly what Ryan is saying about the three nations that he was, the 5 nations, I should say, the 3 cases is what I meant to say, that he was dealing with in his paper, that you have a false understanding of what really is driving international relations theory. And maybe it's underlying there, but I can remember another situation where I was a part of a 10-year project. I wasn't there the full 10 years, but a 10-year project which was basically an exchange between Latin Americanists from the United States and maybe Canada. I don't remember now. This goes way back, I think, to the 1960s. And then a bunch of folks coming up from Latin America. And we met in a different city every year and exchanged ideas. And you know, there were certain rules, and I use that word in italics, or yeah, italics. Well, that'll do. There were certain guidelines that defined a more developed nation, as we might have called them back in those days. You had this trait, you had this trait, you had this trait, you had this trait, and it was almost like a checkoff list. The more you had, the more developed you were. You know, and of course the question was, as defined by whom, and as defined for whom. And basically, I remember very distinctly that the Latin Americanists at the conference, in many cases, and some of the non-Latin Americanists too, for that matter, kind of rejected that theory on hand. That you know, the simple fact of the matter is they had different values, had a different value system, and this, I think, is what Ryan is pointing out. I remember studying a little bit about Africa, and I'm certainly no authority on it, but one of the books that I remember, and it's still actually available, which must have come out, I guess in the early 70s, maybe. Gwendolyn M. Carter's book called Independence for Africa. She was one of the first women American political scientists, Africanists, if I can get all of that in there. And, you know, and also then taking a look at some of the, you know, in which she said, you know, like virtually, and I'm saying this, she didn't actually say it, but, you know, in which we see that in the late 1950s, most of Africa was under the colonial thumb until Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah really started, in a sense, the independence movement. Well, by 1970, they were almost all independent. And this brought up a whole question of new minds, new thoughts, new ideas, which were basically really repressed in many cases by much of the educational system, and certainly by the dominating theories of the West. I remember another book of the same time period, 1972, I think it was, how Europe de-developed Africa. Anybody remember that one? How Europe de-developed Africa, by Walter Rodney, famous Guyanese professor who actually spent a great deal of his time teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. You know, but taking a look at colonialism and the negative aspects of colonialism and the negative aspects of post-colonial period, we're desperately in need of everybody coming to the table and sharing different viewpoints. For too long, it's been a monolithic kind of, what should we say, a monolithic approach to international relations. And I think this is one of the things that Ryan points out. You know, that relationalism, I guess there is no such word, but there is now, I made it up. But at any rate, you know, is not something that rationality, yes, but the relations, not so much. And so therefore it wasn't brought to the table, it wasn't put into consideration. And I think that's really a very important part of the paper that Ryan brings out, this whole idea of the importance of everybody coming to the table, everybody participating, everybody putting in their ideas, because then that's going to reflect the reality of international relations. A couple of questions I had, I realize I'm running too long and I apologize for that. But a couple of questions I had. Number one, I uses Chin's book. I think that's a very smart move. Chin is very impressive in his background. Although he's American trained, as I remember, he has his PhD from the University of Missouri. But you know, I mean, there's just to mention a few things. Head of the Chinese Foreign Affairs University, Chancellor of the Chinese Diplomatic Academy, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Affairs Review. That's the one by the China Foreign Affairs University, not the one by St. Andrews University. And a fellow of PRIO in Oslo, and then a whole bunch of other credentials that we don't have time for. And so I think his work has to be taken very seriously, and Ryan's using that book as its introduction to the new international relations theory, or a different international relations theory, or a non-Western, or I might say non-Northern international relations theory, was really a very, very important work and a real contribution of the paper when you come right down to it. Ryan talks about Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the what do you want to call it? The boom-bust relationships, if I can use that term, which is one I use often with regard to Puerto Rico and its relationship with both Spain and the United States. Friendly to non-friendly, and to what extent this affects relationships, and to what extent the past historical incidents, and incidents may not be the proper word, occurrences is perhaps a better word, really affect current relationships and how important they are. Certainly, if you just take a look at the, and I won't go through all of them by any means, but if you just take a look at the Korea-Japan, that the whole question of the shrine, the Ashikuni shrine, the shrine to the war heroes, many of whom are not considered war heroes by much of the world, as I'm sure I don't have to explain to you, particularly those involved in World War II, and the comfort women. I mean, that was an issue which came up this weekend in their relationship. This is nothing that's from the past. This has been resurrected and is being hammered on by the Koreans. As I said, it made the news. It made the, one of the international news broadcasts this very weekend. I remember seeing it, and of course, obviously, since it was in Ryan's paper, it instantly caught my undivided attention. The visits by prime ministers and other dignitaries to the shrine, these things are deeply embedded in the memory, and so I think his study of these is really important. What I might like to ask is, do you have any information, and this is not meant in any way as criticism, because it pretty much goes beyond the concept, the scope, I should say, of the paper. But in terms of how does it work when you've got a Western nation, maybe the United States, maybe the UK, whatever the case might be, dealing with a non-Western nation, where you've got relationalism in a sense on one hand, and you've got, the Western view on the other hand. How does this affect the relationship? Is there any way we can deal with that? Just something that it occurred to me when you come right down to it. All right, and also the effect of colonialism. I wonder what effect that has had on the sort of the lack of non-Western or non-Northern international relations. And can we apply some of this information that you have discussed, some of these concepts that you have discussed that are sort of controlling in terms of the development of international relations by the nations which were in your paper? Can we deal with them? Can we deal with that in other areas? Can this be applied to, say, for example, African nations, which may have traditional enmity between them, because many of them, as you know from the colonial experience, are artificially created by the colonizer, and they may have put people together or separated people and, created similar situations to what you're dealing with perhaps in Asia, to what extent that might be true. So, at any rate, does it matter, I guess, was my final point. And it seems to me that it does matter, and I think your paper matters. The only one question I do have, Ryan, and it caused me to reread the section repeatedly because I said I got to be missing something here, and I haven't found it. In your discussion and conclusions, you don't really talk about the Vietnamese Cambodia. You talk about the other two, but not that one. Is there a particular reason why not? Because it just seemed to me it would be more complete if you, since you introduced the three in the beginning, if you discussed the three at the conclusion. All right. And I think that will take care of my comments there. You want me to comment on the other paper right now, and then we'll discuss both of them later?
Yeah, I think that's best,
Okay.
way to go, kind of keep everything.
Turn on your TV and watch Ukraine. And you see a really interesting commentary on the paper that comes to us from Brown University, huh? And Professor Post's paper. What about escalation? To create de-escalation. The use of escalation in order to achieve, I guess we should say, de-escalation. Certainly, and one of the things that Professor Post mentioned in his verbal remarks this evening was it brought me back immediately to World War II. Not that I remember World War II. I must admit I was alive then, but I certainly wasn't politically conscious. But at any rate, it brings me back to World War II because that's a really fine case of escalation to create de-escalation. And to create de-escalation with regard to the immediate nation that you were fighting. And there are some who would suggest maybe create de-escalation with others, using this as an example. What could happen to Japan could happen to you. And of course, the obvious advantage and one of the reasons that it works, and Post brings this point out, is because only one country, had the weapon. Only one country had the bombs, and so therefore they were able to act in a way in which they didn't have to fear the kind of retaliation that you would have to fear today if two major nuclear powers went at it, so to speak. I'm probably the only member of the panel that has been to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and most importantly, North Field. I've actually driven up and down North Field on the island of Tinian, which you may recall is where the Enola Gay took off from on its famous bombing mission. All right, on the island of Tinian, as I say, in the Northern Mariana Islands. Been there, done that. All right, so the question is, does it work? Can it work? Sure. Obviously, it took two bombs. Presumably, the Japanese probably assumed there were more than two. They may not have been correct on that, but that's neither here nor there. All right, and it certainly led the emperor to sue for peace, and the rest of the story is well known. But does it work where you have multiple membership? I mean, this is in the nuclear game. This is, of course, the question. And I think that Professor Post has done a terrific job in taking a look at what was available. You don't have very much available in terms of actual historical practice. Yeah, I can talk about World War II, but that's a different case with a separate set of circumstances. A tremendously separate set of circumstances, which obviously, and I'm sure you all remember this from late 1940s and 1950s history, the Soviet Union made very fast efforts to try to eliminate the difference and to acquire the nuclear weaponry and so forth and so on, to bring itself out of that problem of not being a nuclear power in what is fast becoming a nuclear world. The question is, does it work? Does the limited work? Does a limited use of nuclear weaponry actually succeed in de-escalating? I remember during much of the Cold War, I remember reading about how the NATO, for example, was going to defend Western Europe, and presumably the Russians were going to, and their allies were going to come in and try to conquer Western Europe, and the battle would be in Western Europe. And as I remember, and I may have a faulty memory here, they gave them about 3 days, in which, by which time the Russians would be well on their way towards advancing across Western Europe. But by then, the Americans would have come from Fort Bragg and their other points of origin and would have been in Europe. Their equipment was already in Europe, so you didn't have to worry about bringing it over. You didn't have to worry about supplies, they were already landed. And then there was a plan how you were going to stop them. And then I remember at least some of the discussions or studies or whatever it was that I was dealing with at the time ended with, but the loser will probably go nuclear. And of course, if the loser went nuclear, that would be big time nuclear. That wouldn't be limited nuclear at all. You know, so the question of limited nuclear war is really fascinating. And I think that Professor Post has done a tremendous job in analyzing so many of these war games, as he called them, or situations. I guess pretty much, maybe not everyone that's available, but certainly sufficient numbers, it seems to me, to give us a reasonable picture of what the situation is likely to be. And frankly, I found it to be a scary one. His hypothesis one, he didn't label it as hypothesis one on the cards, but he does label it hypothesis one in the paper. You know, more often than not, it fails, specifically with regard to the nuclear strikes involved. It doesn't work in a majority of the cases. Well, it seems to me that's something we have to deal with right here and now. Turn on the TV tonight, and what do we find? We find a threat of escalation. Could be limited nuclear escalation. Could be non-nuclear, some sort of chemical warfare or biological warfare, or whatever the case might be. Threats to escalate if you. So if you invade into our airspace, we're going to escalate. If you do this, we're going to do that. Actually doing it, actually escalating. So it seems to me that his, and again, I realize I'm running too long here, but it seems to me that his warning to us, his research poses a warning to us to be careful that that doesn't work, in the sense that it doesn't bring de-escalation. It may bring war. It may bring nuclear catastrophe. It may bring chemical warfare, but it apparently does not, in a vast majority, apparently, it seems to me from his study of cases, does not bring the de-escalation that we're looking for. And I think I should stop there, because otherwise I'll dominate a little bit too much time. So thank you for your kindness in listening.
Thank you so much. I'll give some time for the presenters to respond. And then I can ask a couple of questions. We'll go from there.
Sure, we should stick with the order and have Ryan go first if you want, just to keep it logical, maybe.
Sure.
Great. Then I'll ask Frank to repeat some of his questions. So you mentioned the question on the discussion, and I'll definitely get to that, the discussion section. You ask whether Chin's theories can apply to Africa. And I also appreciate your comments as a Latin America specialist to expand kind of the theoretical scope. And was there another question? Just to make sure I got them all.
If there was, I don't remember, because it was off the cuff.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Then I'll just address the discussion really quickly.
So I just want to interject. I think the other question was, what happens if you introduce another Western power?
Yeah, that was
within that dyad.
That was actually my favorite question. So I'll definitely address that. Briefly, I'll just mention the discussion. Short story, we added the Cambodia-Vietnam case late to our paper. It was a late edition. So we're still in the drafting process of that case study. And one of the last steps will be to address it in the discussion. Certainly the paper would be incomplete without a discussion of this case as we discuss the others. So thank you for bringing that up. To what extent Chin applies to, well, let's say Africa or Latin America, I think reading Chin, would be cautious about applying him everywhere, because that, in a sense, would be to mistaken his work as a non-Western work, rather than, or as you rightly put it, a non-Northern work, whichever we choose. And I think his work is best understood as a Chinese work. And so I already felt maybe difficulty applying his theory outside of China because the extent to which he draws on Confucianist culture may not be, that may not reflect the diversity within East and Southeast Asia alone, let alone Africa and Latin America. And I think what we can take from Chin's work is, I agree, it's a very impressive work, and him as a credentialed scholar, I was very happy to work with his piece, but rather as a call to develop new theories that are based on the cultural traditions of those regions, rather than applying Confucianist culture to Africa, which I think would be a similar mistake as to apply rational, based or even, even deeper Christian based, culture onto different regions. So I would personally be careful about applying his work outside to say that it is a universal, non-Western, non-Northern work. The last question is very interesting, and I think I, as an American, had enough issue wrapping my head around this idea of relationality as opposed to rationality, and the idea that maybe intimacy is not similarly connected to importance. Maybe a new economic deal might not increase the intimacy between relations, at least in Asia, was enough difficulty for me. I think when you add a clash, it's difficult, I think, to what theory do you bring to explain this clash, when, at least from my perspective, every theory has a cultural basis, is a very difficult question. And certainly, I think the first step, at least from my perspective, is to start to use more theories in our empirical work that aren't, Western, Northern American, European, to expand that work. And by doing that, maybe we'll have more answers to your question on how to deal with the interaction between a rationalistic state versus a relationalistic state.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I actually had a question for you, and feel free to answer it via email or something later if you want. But I'm just curious that rationality is a necessary assumption in deterrence theory and the whole field in which I operate. And so I was really intrigued by this idea of like, whoa, wait a minute. How could relationality play into deterrence and to coercion and into compellence and all these other issues? And I'm just curious. I know it's not at all what you wrote about in this paper, but do you see any sort of any thoughts come to your head of how that would play in, this relational theory of IR would come into the deterrence field?
Yeah, I could only say, not being an expert at all in deterrence theory or your work, that it seems it would make your job a lot harder to operate outside of the assumption of rationality. At least maybe it would be harder for us, being seeped in the tradition of rationality. It seems to me a very worthy endeavor, especially when you would put in the calculus a nuclear clash between an actor, say, like the United States versus China. And that brings up Frank's question, is how do we deal with two countries that maybe bring these different cultural perspectives? Does it matter whether the United States, tries to escalate by de-escalate against Russia, against the United Kingdom,
Yeah.
or against China, right? And again, that would make your job quite a lot harder. right?
Yeah,
To
it would
introduce
absolutely
this.
make it would absolutely make it harder. And I was thinking about the application in terms of also, when we think about conflict and war, we think about between historical enemies, the U.S. and the Soviets, or these adversaries. They're adversaries for a long time before we worry about them going to war usually with each other. But what happens when friends turn on each other? Now you have this past of intimacy, and does deterrence work differently then, or coercion? Presumably, it might actually help you coerce because you know more about them. So I actually think there's some really interesting ways that the relationality would matter, and it gave me just some good thoughts. So I'm glad I got to read your paper.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in terms of your the comments about my paper, I thank you for your comments, Frank. And it's I absolutely do think of it as sort of a warning. I was motivated to do this project because I found the logic behind this thinking and the prevalence of this thinking to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find out if and my background, I'm in the Navy, and I served at the U.S. Strategic Command, where we were responsible for all the U.S. nuclear plans and weapons. And one of my other projects explores how prevalent is this thinking in the U.S. strategic community. And I do that through exploring or interviewing elite members, former commanders of Strategic Command, former secretaries of defense, former senior level strategists and policymakers. And I find that this belief is, at least so far, it's not a majority, but it's significant. It's present to a significant degree that this type of thinking is there. And so I wanted to kind of explore the logic of this and see what I could find. And so I worked really hard to find available war games. There are others out there. The bulk of the ones that would really be interesting are classified, and so they're usually run at the secret or top secret level. And at some point, I will look into getting some of that data declassified, or pulling very top level de-identified sort of data and work on that. But I suspect that I'll find the same thing, that the relationship between escalation and conflict termination is a complicated one, and it needs to be thought through. Well, one of the ways to maybe describe it is that thinking escalation to de-escalate is a good idea is incomplete at best and naive at worst, or even worse than that. But it's incomplete. You have to think, well, what happens if my signal and my attempt to do this fails? Then what? And a lot of times when you hear people talk about it, that's where the thinking stops. It stops. And you brought up NATO strategy. That was the NATO strategy. If we're losing conventionally against the Soviet onslaught, we will use nuclear weapons. And basically the policy documents stopped and said, this will cause them to give up. Incomplete at best, and potentially catastrophic. And then the other thing I think about, and I want to explore this further, is if both sides in a conflict ascribe to this type of thinking, there's only one logical outcome, right? If I escalate in just the right way, I can achieve de-escalation. And if both sides think this way, you have a reciprocal thing that, especially amongst nuclear armed adversaries, can quickly get out of hand. And so I appreciate that it was seen as a warning. I don't claim that the sample is fully representative or covers all scenarios or all, but I do think it's a remarkably consistent story in what I was able to find. And so, I'm going to keep digging, and of course, I'm happy for suggestions. And if any of you ever read about a war game that I didn't include, please tell me about it, because they're hard to find, and I would be grateful. But and I think, was there anything else you wanted me to comment on before I turn it over to any other questions?
No, that's fine with me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this has been fun. In case you're wondering why a Brown University guy is here, I'm a Staten Island, New York native. I grew up in Staten Island, went all through high school and graduated, and I attended the conference in Staten Island, I guess just before COVID. If any of you were there, I don't know, at Wagner College a couple of years ago.
I was there.
So I was there for that conference as well, and
Of course, it's easy for me.
yeah, I was in Rhode Island, and I made the drive. It was fun, and anyways, that's my connection to the New York State Political Science Association. But it's been fun, and I've kept an eye out for what's going on this part of the country. So thanks for having me.
But thank you both. I mean, I'm very excited with this discussion. A lot of wonderful things to think about, and I had a chance to go through the two papers. I have a couple of questions and just thoughts. We are kind of running out of time. We're at almost 3 minutes before 9, but we can continue a little bit of discussion here. I'll ask Ryan first. So while reading your paper, I felt there are massive parallels to constructivism as a way of thinking about IR. So for example, there is this idea of the anarchy is what states make of it. And that is kind of driven by state identity and norms. And there are friendly states and enemy states. And how do that come into being? So I guess I am have not read Chin now because of this conference. I'm going to go ahead and get a copy and start reading it. I teach IR, so it will be great for students to kind of, and me to kind of understand this. But I was coming with this idea that how does it relate to social constructivism? Because it seems kind of very similar to the social constructivist idea that states, actions of states are driven by norms and identities, and how norms developed within international community and so on. And second is to kind of look at post-colonial theory, as Frank was pointing out, and mainly Dipesh Chakraborty and others who are seeing themselves as non-Western political theorists and applying post-colonialism to international relations. So, for example, making interventions like when people say it's the long peace in Europe, it's actually massive devastation happening all over the world, right? Wanton killing, wanton bombing, and so on. So World War I and World War II had already happened in the colonies, these kinds of bombing civilian areas and so on and so forth. It was just another rehearsal in Europe. So for post-colonial scholars, World War I, II, sure, but those strategies had already been there. That, for example, Britain bombing Baghdad, and things like that, or United States bombing Nicaragua, for that example. So kind of looking at post-colonial scholars, right, and their relation to maybe what Chin is trying to talk about, or maybe differences within it. Because when you say non-Western international theory, post-colonialism is something that's already been there and one of the most faster growing disciplines. And is Chin a post-colonial scholar then? And in what way he's also a constructivist or not? So that was one idea I was thinking about as I was engaging with your work. And Daniel, I read your work. I was interested in it. I teach international relations, so we talk about strategic madness and so on. Couple of things. One thing is about strategic madness, right? So if I can, so Nixon was famous for saying that if they think I'm a crazy human being, let them think that I'm a crazy human being. That is a way to escalate in order to de-escalate. And maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, with Kennedy putting it at DEFCON 3, was a form of escalation which could de-escalate. So is there a way to look at escalation beyond nuclear usage? And if that works, and how does credibility work in that way? Is there a trigger strategy that can be used? So on and so forth. And also kind of, thinking about, how international law has, or Hague, for example, has talked about it, right? So threat to nuclear war and usage of nuclear war is not completely banned, right? There is a small space where the court agrees that it could be used for your own survival, which is something that the Russians had been saying, even in interviews with US media. They're just giving the verdict of the Hague. So kind of thinking about it, does that do some shaming? That you don't, that there is no way to use nuclear weapons that can comply also with humanitarian laws and so on and so forth, right? So while reading this, I was, I felt about a couple of books. Governing from the Sky, it's about the history of air warfare. That's a really good book to kind of look at, and also to look at kind of this internecine fight between basically the US Army Air Force trying to extricate itself out from the army to say that, look, we have that weapon which will give us kind of freedom within the bureaucratic structure, right? So the usage of nuclear weapon was not more about de-escalation or escalation, in fact, but rather a function of other bureaucratic fight going on between different service branches of United States. And that's kind of very well written in that Governing from the Skies. And another book I've been reading by Sam Carlson, it's a Princeton study of history and politics. It's called Secret Wars. And it's a history of secret wars.
Austin Carson.
So in the case of, that's right. And, it starts with that US and Russia both engaged with each other during Korea for 2 years, and kept it in complete secret. So they didn't want to escalate to de-escalate. Even they didn't want their own public to know, because public pressure can create its own momentum. So these are just broad thoughts I had, and I just enjoyed both of your papers, really. It was a great time reading them and thinking about them. So
thank you. And Austin
if you want
Carson's,
to, comment or whatever.
Well, I just to say on Austin Carson's book, it's great. It's really interesting, and like Frank mentioned earlier, I learned a lot reading that book about the history of it that he digs up. But my own interest in it and reaction to it was, it's impossible to keep a nuclear use a secret. And so that mechanism for escalation control that he describes in that project is impossible in a nuclear war. And so it's just one more X that you can cross out for ways that you can prevent escalation. It's not going to work in the nuclear setting. And so, but it's a really good piece, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I kind of forgotten about it today, but that was good. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you also for your comments and your questions. Certainly, the parallel to social constructivism appears very clear. I think perhaps a closer parallel, and I don't want to credit this as my idea, I'll credit Professor Path with this idea that Chin can be seen a little bit more as a post-structuralist, and the difference being, do states arrive to an interaction with another state with a solid preformed identity, which would be the constructivist position, or do states have no, the post-structuralists would say no pre-discursive identity, and maybe Chin would say no pre-relational identity. So Chin might say that state relations are always being, or state identity is always being constructed through relations, and maybe there isn't such a thing as a pre-relational identity. I think that if I could pin down the biggest difference between Chin and social constructivism, it would be that. In terms of your allusion to post-colonialism, I think that's certainly, if you think about an area of non-Western IR, this seems to be clearly something that's established, whereas Chinese IR is more recent. I think perhaps, at least from my understanding, there isn't as well developed an account of Chinese IR as Qin, and this was published 4 years ago. So this is certainly an emerging field. I would have to admit I'm not an expert in post-colonialism to make the determination whether Qin is one or not. It would be interesting to hear somebody who is an expert in post-colonialism to read Qin and make that determination. But certainly, if you're talking about a well-established or more well-developed area of non-Western IR theory, certainly we could look at post-colonialism. Could I throw in a question for Daniel, just as a, yeah. You talk about reputational costs, and I assume do you mean in both ways, reputational costs for the aggressor and the receiver, or are you looking more at one or the other? As a basis of my question, since you're talking about nuclear powers, do you think that great powers have a higher demand for, like, there would be higher reputational costs as a great power that is nuclear armed that receives an attack? Do you see that there might be higher reputational costs as a great power to not respond as opposed to a non-nuclear armed or non-great power, if there's a difference in the reputational costs?
I do. I mean, it's part of the sort of the theoretical reasoning about why this is especially unlikely to work in the nuclear setting, is because particularly a great power, the larger nuclear states will suffer, or at least they will feel they will suffer greater reputational costs if they don't respond with their nuclear arsenals that they spent years and years developing and years and years and years talking about. I mean, one of the things that's unique about the nuclear enterprise is that it's pretty vocal about what they're for and why we meaning any nuclear state, why they have them. And when you are constantly beating that drum, and then the very thing you've created them for happens, and you don't use them in response, you may feel pressure to do that. And that's, I actually think it shouldn't increase, and this is kind of ties to the broader theory of the nuclear revolution that Jervis wrote about, and that it should be true, but it's not true. Leaders don't think the way that they should if the nuclear revolution were to have taken place. But so I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that. And I do think about it from the other side too, that the aggressor suffers a reputational cost by crossing this particular line. And whereas not only the receiving state, but other states will say, wow, that state is really crazy, or that state is really bad, or that state is really, Putin's really off his rocker now. They'll suffer as well. So I think about it from both ends, but particularly this is a theory about the incentives on the receiving side. What incentives would they have to either respond or de-escalate? And so hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. I mean, in that regard, I was thinking it's more of a chicken game, right? That I don't really want to use my nuclear weapon. I just want to say I would and make it credible. And if that actually serves the purpose, then nobody really needs to use it as long as it's credible threat. So I was just wondering if you think about in terms of game theory and think about, like, if we take away nuclear weapons, does escalation to de-escalate work? And as soon as you add nuclear weapons, that strategy completely goes away. It's not going to work. And if one party has nuclear weapons, another party does not, then how does that work? Like Russia keeps saying that, it's an option. But is that strategically, how do we make of it as international scholars, and especially as an expert that you are looking at?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. One of the things I'll say is that it's not, you may be dealing with a nuclear state and a non-nuclear state, like Russia and Ukraine, but every nuclear state has strong reasons to get involved in it. So, what would happen if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, for example? It's not just going to be between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think it's going to be. And so and one of the things if you were to write a list of things that states are hoping to limit in terms of escalation, one of those things is always in a war is the involvement of other states. Because if you can keep it, you engaged in a conflict with this adversary for a reason, probably because you thought you had a good chance of winning, but that's dependent on other people not being involved. And so one of the the top of the list of things that we hope to limit is the escalation or expansion of a conflict to other states. Again, another place where particularly nuclear use adds complications that are not present when you're dealing with non-nuclear states. And so it would be interesting to kind of do the same project and look at where neither side has nuclear weapons and see if escalatory strategies are more effective at sending the right signals. But I'd say probably a slight margin in favor of those successes would be my guess, but I don't know. But that would be my guess. There's something about this is a project about nuclear, the effect that nuclear weapons has, and I think nuclear weapons make these challenges of escalation management. I think it makes them infinitely more difficult and or very much more difficult. So that's kind of at least that's my view. And I'm wrong about lots of things, so I'm probably wrong about this too, but
No, I mean, I think the paper drives home the point of this impossibility to have the escalate to de-escalate strategy with nuclear weapons, and that's satisfying to me rather than the opposite result. Well, I think I'm not going to detain everyone on a Monday night. We are already at 9:13, so I'm going to stop the recording now. This will be available with NYSPSA website for everyone to see, and please write to our authors and discussants and me. Our emails would be with the website also. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.